In the spring of 1945, as America raced to complete the most devastating weapon ever conceived, a fierce battle erupted in Washington, not between military commanders and their enemies, but between two men on the same side. One was a hard-charging general who believed Kyoto, Japan's ancient capital, should be incinerated by atomic fire. The other was an aging statesman who would stake his reputation on saving it. Their clash would determine the fate of a 1,000-year-old city and reveal a profound truth about power, duty, and the terrible choices of war. I'm Frank Dawson. Before we dive into this story, please give this video a like. It really helps push the video to more viewers and supports the channel. General Leslie Richard Groves was not a man accustomed to being told no. At 50 years old in 1945, Groves had built the Pentagon in record time, managed the largest construction project in military history, and now commanded the Manhattan Project, the $2 billion gamble to build an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany. He was brilliant, demanding, and utterly convinced of his own judgment. His subordinates described him as a human bulldozer. When Groves wanted something done, it got done. By March 1945, that bomb was nearly ready. Germany would surrender in May, but Japan fought on with fanatical determination. American casualties mounted with each island captured. Iwo Jima cost nearly 7,000 American dead. Okinawa would claim over 12,000 more. Military planners estimated that invading Japan's home islands could result in 1 million Allied casualties. Groves knew his weapon could end the war, but where should it fall? He assembled a target committee of military officers and scientists at Los Alamos in April and May 1945. Their mission: identify Japanese cities that would demonstrate the bomb's devastating power and shock Japan into surrender. The committee worked methodically, evaluating dozens of potential targets based on specific criteria. The target needed to be large enough to showcase the weapon's destructive radius, at least 3 miles across. It should contain war industries, military installations, or headquarters. Ideally, it should be relatively undamaged by conventional bombing, so the atomic bomb's unique effects would be unmistakable. And it should have psychological significance that would impact Japanese morale and leadership. One city rose to the top of every list: Kyoto. To Groves and his committee, Kyoto made perfect military sense. With a population of over 1 million, it was Japan's 4th largest city. It contained electronics factories, precision instrument manufacturers, and machine tool plants supporting the war effort. Its university produced scientists and engineers. The city's layout, a broad valley surrounded by mountains, would contain and amplify the blast, maximizing destruction. But Kyoto offered something else that appealed to Groves's strategic mind: psychological impact. As Japan's ancient capital for over 1,000 years, Kyoto held immense cultural and emotional significance. It housed hundreds of Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines, and irreplaceable treasures of Japanese civilization. The destruction of Kyoto, Groves calculated, would break Japan's will to fight in a way no other target could match. In May 1945, Groves placed Kyoto at the very top of the target list, designated AA priority. Hiroshima, Yokohama, and Kokura followed. The general believed he had made the correct choice. He had done his job. He had no idea that the most powerful man in Washington was about to become his adversary. Henry Louis Stimson was 77 years old in 1945, ancient by the standards of wartime Washington. He had served as Secretary of War under President Taft, Secretary of State under President Hoover, and now held the War Department portfolio again under Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. He was a Republican serving Democratic presidents, a man whose integrity transcended party politics. Stimson had dedicated his life to public service, but the weight of this war pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had overseen the mobilization of millions of soldiers, approved countless operations that sent young men to their deaths, and now bore responsibility for a weapon that could kill 100,000 people in an instant. In late May 1945, Stimson attended a meeting where General Groves presented the target list. When the secretary saw Kyoto at the top, he felt physically ill. Stimson knew Kyoto, not from intelligence reports or reconnaissance photographs, but from personal experience. Decades earlier, during his honeymoon in Japan, Stimson and his wife Mabel had spent days in Kyoto, walking through its ancient temples, gardens, and shrines. He had marveled at the Golden Pavilion, reflected in its perfect pond. He had witnessed centuries of art, architecture, and spiritual devotion preserved in that single city. More importantly, Stimson understood what Groves apparently did not. Kyoto wasn't just militarily significant. It was the soul of Japanese civilization. Destroying it wouldn't break Japan's will to fight. It would create eternal hatred against America. It would poison relations with Japan for generations. It would make the United States look like vandals, no better than the Nazis who had bombed cultural treasures across Europe. After the meeting, Stimson called Groves to his office. "Kyoto must be removed from the list," Stimson told him firmly. Groves was stunned. He laid out his military reasoning, the size, the industries, the psychological impact. He had chosen Kyoto after careful analysis. The decision was sound. Stimson was unmoved. "This is one order I'm giving that you will not challenge," he said. "Kyoto will not be bombed." For one of the few times in his life, Leslie Groves had been overruled. But the general was not a man who accepted defeat easily. What followed was an extraordinary power struggle that lasted nearly 3 months, a clash between military necessity and moral responsibility, between a general who knew how to win wars and a statesman who understood how to win peace. Groves was relentless. He kept Kyoto on the target list and continued preparations for striking it. He argued his case to anyone who would listen. The general believed that Stimson, at 77, was being sentimental and emotional rather than strategic. Groves saw himself as the realist, making the hard choice that would save American lives. Stimson was equally determined. Every time Groves submitted paperwork with Kyoto included, Stimson struck it from the list. The secretary attended multiple meetings where he had to repeat his prohibition. His diary from this period shows his growing frustration, not just with Groves, but with the terrible burden of these decisions. On June 1st, Groves tried again, presenting detailed analysis of why Kyoto remained the optimal target. Stimson rejected it immediately. On July 21st, with the Potsdam Conference underway in Germany, Groves sent yet another memo advocating for Kyoto. He was in Germany with President Truman and could have discussed it there, but Stimson had made certain he controlled this decision. The secretary recognized that Groves would not stop unless faced with unambiguous final authority. On July 22nd, Stimson requested a private audience with President Truman in Potsdam. In the little White House where Truman was staying, Stimson made his case. He explained Kyoto's cultural significance. He warned that destroying it would turn Japan into a permanent enemy. He argued that America, having fought to preserve civilization against Nazi barbarism, should not become destroyers of civilization themselves. The United States needed Japan as a stable ally after the war, especially with Soviet ambitions in Asia. Bombing Kyoto would make that impossible. Truman listened carefully. The new president, thrust into office just 3 months earlier after Roosevelt's death, had enormous respect for Stimson's judgment. When Stimson finished, Truman's response was immediate and unequivocal. "I agree with you completely," Truman said. "Kyoto's off the target list. That's final." With presidential authority behind him, Stimson had won. Groves would have no more opportunities to argue for Kyoto. A replacement target was needed, and Nagasaki was added to the list alongside Hiroshima, Kokura, and Niigata. But why had this required such a prolonged battle? Why couldn't Groves accept the decision? To understand Leslie Groves, you must understand what drove him. The general was not a cruel man or a warmonger. He was an engineer who approached problems methodically, seeking optimal solutions. To Groves, warfare was applied mathematics. You calculated the most efficient path to victory and followed it without sentiment. Groves had spent 3 years managing the Manhattan Project, dealing with temperamental scientists, impossible deadlines, and stakes beyond comprehension. If the bomb failed, $2 billion and America's best scientific minds would be wasted. If it succeeded but didn't end the war, the invasion of Japan would proceed, and hundreds of thousands would die in conventional combat. From Groves's perspective, choosing Kyoto wasn't barbarism, it was mercy. One terrible blow to end the war immediately, versus months of firebombing, starvation blockades, and ultimately invasion. He had done the cold calculus that commanders must do in war. Every factor pointed to Kyoto. What Groves couldn't see or wouldn't see was beyond the mathematics. He couldn't see that some things mattered more than efficiency. He couldn't imagine that destroying Kyoto might win the war but lose the peace. He was a general trained to destroy the enemy, not a statesman responsible for building the post-war world. This wasn't weakness or failure on Groves's part. It was the limitation of his role. Generals must sometimes think the unthinkable and do the unbearable. But in a democracy, generals answer to civilian leadership precisely because military logic alone is insufficient for the profound moral choices of war. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., the B-29 bomber Enola Gay released Little Boy over Hiroshima. The city that Groves had ranked below Kyoto became the first target of atomic warfare. 3 days later, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki after clouds obscured the primary target of Kokura. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. Kyoto remained untouched. Its temples, shrines, and treasures survived. Today, millions of tourists visit the city each year, walking the same streets where Stimson walked decades before. The Golden Pavilion still reflects in its pond. Ancient gardens still bloom with cherry blossoms each spring. What would have happened if Groves had prevailed? We can only speculate, but Stimson's fears were well-founded. The destruction of Mecca would enrage the Muslim world for centuries. The destruction of the Vatican would alienate 1 billion Catholics. Kyoto held similar significance for Japanese culture and identity. After the war, Japan became America's strongest ally in Asia, a stable, democratic, and prosperous nation. That transformation required Japanese willingness to work with their former enemies. Would that have been possible if America had deliberately destroyed the heart of their cultural heritage? Almost certainly not. Stimson's decision to save Kyoto may have been as important to winning the peace as Groves's management of the Manhattan Project was to winning the war. Groves went on to a distinguished career, receiving the Distinguished Service Medal and retiring as a lieutenant general in 1948. He never publicly criticized Stimson's decision, though he remained convinced that his military analysis had been sound. In his memoirs, he wrote about the Kyoto controversy with respect for Stimson, even as he defended his own recommendations. Stimson retired in September 1945, his health broken by the strain of war. He died in 1950, knowing he had helped shape not just victory, but the terms of peace that followed. The story of Kyoto teaches us something essential about democratic leadership in wartime. Military expertise is crucial. We need generals like Groves who can think strategically, who understand the brutal arithmetic of war, who can make the hard choices that victory requires. But we also need something more. We need civilian leaders with the wisdom to see beyond the battlefield, to understand that wars end and nations must live with their choices. We need statesmen who remember that the enemy of today may be the ally of tomorrow, and that how we win matters almost as much as whether we win. In the spring and summer of 1945, these two men, the relentless general and the aging statesman, fought their private war over a city neither would ever see destroyed. Groves had logic, analysis, and military necessity on his side. Stimson had memory, wisdom, and moral authority on his. History proved Stimson right. Not because military considerations don't matter, but because they're not the only things that matter. Sometimes the harder choice, the choice that looks weak or sentimental to purely military eyes, is actually the wiser path. Kyoto still stands because one 77-year-old man remembered walking through its gardens with his wife and understood that some things once destroyed can never be recovered. Because he knew that nations, like men, must live with their deeds long after the immediate crisis passes. That understanding, that wars are fought not just for victory, but for the kind of world we want to inhabit after the guns fall silent, may be Secretary Stimson's greatest legacy.